Welcome everyone to our annual Grey Swan webinar. My name's Bilal Hafeez and I am the CEO and Head of Research at Hive. I'm joined today by Richard Jones, who's a new member of the Hive team and network, and I'll allow him to introduce himself before we jump into the meat of our webinar. So Richard, why don't you tell our audience about yourself?
Thanks, Bilal. Well, hey, everyone. As Bilal says, my name is Richard Jones. I've recently joined Hive as a contributor. My background is primarily in the FX and rate space since the sort of mid-90s. I've also worked as a strategist on the macro side. And when Bilal asked me last week to co-host the Grey Swans event with him, I was delighted to accept. So really glad to be here and looking forward to this event.
Great, thanks, Richard. And so the format of this is myself and Richard, we're going to go through each of the Grey Swans. We'll talk about the ones that we particularly enjoyed. We'll go through them all, and hopefully you'll learn something about possible risk events for next year. And just in case you don't know what a Grey Swan is, there's a Black Swan event, which is something that Nassim Taleb popularized many, many years ago with his book. And Black Swan events are totally unexpected, low probability, high impact events that occur. And by definition, they are something that we can't really predict or even imagine. So they're events that happen completely out of the blue. Now, its close cousin is the Grey Swan, which is what we focus on. So what we do at Hive is that each year, as we come into the end of the year, we ask the team and our broader network for ideas around what we call Grey Swan events for the upcoming year. And what we mean by Grey Swan events are these are not events which we think are our base case for next year or even a high probability event for the following year. Instead, they are low probability risk events that are vaguely possible, and if they were to occur, they would have a big impact on financial markets. So this is our way of stretching our minds a bit, thinking outside of the box and coming up with ideas for the following year. And through this, whether you agree or disagree with the Grey Swans, hopefully it will allow you to think much more objectively about the year ahead. So I prefer not to do year ahead outlooks. I prefer to do those at the start of the new year. Instead, at the end of the year, I like to look at Grey Swans. One thing I'd also like to sort of flag and show off is, as you came into the webinar, you may have seen this image of a Grey Swan. We've been playing a lot with AI. Many of you may know that ChatGPT got released a week or so ago, which is this natural language AI model where you can type in prompts and it comes up with responses. But there's also an image version of this. So what we did was we asked an image AI engine to come up with a Grey Swan from Hive, and so it came up with this out of its own imagination. So this is supposed to be a Grey Swan with a hive in the background, obviously Hive, that's our company. And so this is a completely AI generated image, and so we're playing around a lot more with this AI technology. I'd also note that the Football World Cup is going on, and we published a World Cup guide a few weeks ago, and in that one of our articles there was entirely written by an AI bot. So this is a new frontier that we're seeing. But back to the Grey Swans. And we've been publishing this over the past week. So if you just go to our website, and this is actually free for everybody. So if you go to the macrohive.com website, go to the homepage, you can start to see some of the Grey Swans. So this is Grey Swan number 8. We published yesterday, which is about Elon Musk. We have another on Australia. If you click here, you can get the full list. And this is open to everybody, whether you're a premium member, a prime member of Hive or not. You can see all of the Grey Swans. And you can receive our free email if you go to subscribe and this free light. Just put your email address here and you'll get our free weekly email. And then there's a paid option as well if you want to upgrade to a more sophisticated option. But definitely sign up to the free letter if you're not already a member. So we have all of these Grey Swans. And so let me hand this over now to Richard. So what we're going to do is, Richard and myself, we're going to basically go through each Grey Swan, talk about the ones that we liked, and run through them. And then towards the end, we can open up the webinar to questions as well. There's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen where you can just ask questions as we go along, or towards the end at least. So Richard, What are some of the great ones you liked, and which ones do you want to talk about first?
So the first one I'm going to talk about, Bilal, is a very peculiar German coup, which was written by Thorsten Wegner. And what I'm about to say will probably show my age, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyhow. I thought that this Grey Swan piece read very much like a 1980s Tom Clancy Cold War spy novel thriller. I mean, it has the tension, the pacing, the suspense of Clancy at his best. And I thought it was interesting that in the footnote to this Grey Swan piece, Thorsten himself said that, when things settle down and the world resumes some sort of level of normality like we're accustomed to, he might actually try and turn this into a book. So if I dig into the piece itself, the whole notion, the setting is the President of the United States and his chief of staff are in the Oval Office. It's a Friday night, and the president is about to head off to Nantucket for the weekend. His chief of staff says, "Mr. President, I have some very alarming news to share with you. There's been a coup in Germany." And the president was absolutely shocked by this news and asked, "What's going on? How did this happen? Give me all the details." And so the chief of staff outlines specifically what happened. It's a lawful, constitutionally valid overthrow of the German government based on a set of rules that the US helped to draft back during the Cold War days. And I think that the chief of staff cites Article 20, Section 4 of the German Constitution as the means or the reasoning behind why the government had been overthrown, and that the people who perpetrated the coup were seeking to replace it. So the backdrop is that there's been a lot of rioting and social unrest in Germany because of energy blackouts, gas shortages, and in order to give a semblance of order to what's going on in Germany, a coup has been undertaken. So this is a huge surprise. The president's absolutely shocked. The intelligence community in the US is shocked. They've been speaking with their French and English counterparts. Everybody is really surprised by this. And it's a Friday night, and they need to figure out what they're going to do over the weekend before the markets reopen on Monday. And if they don't come up with a decent plan, I think what Thorsten wrote was that Armageddon awaits. So I think this, as far-fetched as this sounds, and as crazy as this
I have to say, this was pretty wild in terms of Grey Swan contributions. I don't think anyone's really pushed the boundary this far before in terms of outlandish scenarios. So what we're saying is there's a military coup in effect in Germany as a risk scenario for next year.
Well, as we were saying offline just before we started, not only is pushing the boundaries in terms of a scenario, but also the way that it's written is very unique and very different to what we would typically expect to receive in a Grey Swan piece. But I think, the real takeaway from this is that Thorsten's highlighting that the world is full of systemic fragilities, and these are known and unknown, and that events can move really quickly and crises can emerge seemingly out of nothing. And I think the way that he wrote this, and then the actual scenario itself, very much ties into that theme of global systemic fragilities and stuff coming out of nowhere to really surprise everybody. So I think it's a brilliant piece.
I mean, one thing that resonated with me on the piece is that if you think about it, if you look at Italy, for example, it's had a number of technocratic governments over the last 10 years. So technically, that's not quite democratic either. And then on top of that, if you go back to, say, the 70s, the last period of inflation, that was a period of large amount of unrest, anarchist, terrorist groups and so on. So, it's not, beyond the pale, this type of scenario.
Well, even something a little bit less dramatic than that. I mean, look, if I'd have said to you exactly 1 year ago today that by this time we would have had 3 different prime ministers sitting in number 10 Downing Street during that time period, and that there would not have been an election, and that during that time period, the gilt market would have come close to absolutely collapsing entirely, you would have thought, okay, that's a little bit far-fetched, but
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah,
right?
That makes sense. So that one is
that
one was Grey Swan number 4. So if you go to our website, you can read it. It's really well written. It's probably the sort of gripping read.
Yeah, so I'll pass it over to you, Bilal. Which one do you want to focus on
Yeah,
next?
so what I'll talk about is Grey Swan number 5. I'm just reading off my Grey Swan printout here. This is Grey Swan number 5 is Japan hikes rates, and this was written by John Turek, who's one of the friends of Macro Hive. We often collaborate together in different ways. Now, this I would say is not, for me, it's between a white and a gray swan, because many people for years have been looking for Japan to hike rates. But the way John presents it, I think, is quite compelling. And he essentially has two components to the view why next year they could hike rates and why it didn't happen this year. Number one was that there was an upper house election in Japan in 2022, where Kishida, the prime minister, had quite a large majority, and his mandate was reflation and growth in the economy. And then the other component of the view is that Kuroda, the Bank of Japan governor, has started to shift his tone somewhat to basically say that monetary policy is working. The economy has started to recover. Wages have started to pick up. Now, Kuroda's term ends in around April next year, so he could be laying the groundwork for his successor to end up raising rates. So you have this kind of combination of the government being much more active on the fiscal policy side, so using that lever to sort of manage the economy. And then on the other hand, you have ultra easy monetary policy, which doesn't make sense in an environment of rising inflation, growing kind of wage pressures. And so Turek, lays out the case how next year this could happen. Moreover, he argues that the nature of BOJ policy is that they tend not to be gradual in what they do. They go from 0 to 100 or 100 to 0. And so what you'll see is suddenly, yield curve control, where yields up to 10 years are kept below 0.25%, suddenly it breaks and you have this jump in policy. So he makes a case that this will happen next year, or this is a gray swan event for next year, like a binary event where you get a sudden jump and shift in BOJ policy. Now, I would say it is a gray swan in the way Turek presents it, because the general view in the market is that the Bank of Japan is ultimately quite cautious, and so they would never do anything that dramatic. But nevertheless, there are sort of pressures sort of building up, and so he lays out quite a good case and a series of events that could see this occur.
Yeah, the one thing that I would say is that John is such a compelling voice on anything BOJ or Japan related that anything that he writes is definitely worth reading on the subject. And even if this does sort of run contrary to the view that the BOJ is very conservative and will take its time in doing things, the fact does remain, as you said, that in these times that we're living in, it does seem that the Bank of Japan's policy is a little bit incongruent with what's going on in the rest of the world. Certainly on the policy side, if you look at their G7 counterparts in the central bank space, they're the standouts. They're very, very different to all the rest. So I think John's piece is definitely thought provoking, and as I say, as one of the sort of the best voices out there in the BOJ in Japan, I think it's definitely worth a read.
Yeah. And Richard, so what's your next great one that you want to talk about?
So the next one I wanted to focus on was John Tierney's piece, where he talks about a recession like no other. And one thing I'd say to begin with is I love John's pieces. I think his stuff is always really well conceived, rigorously researched, and articulated in a really effective way. And this piece is no exception. So the piece starts out with John, I think, quite rightly highlighting that there are a lot of traditional yield curve metrics in the US, where we see some curve inversion on looking at varying metrics pointing towards a recession. And this is despite the labor market continuing to be incredibly robust. And then for me, I think maybe the most interesting part of the piece, simply because I like looking at things through a historical perspective, John sort of nails 1990 as the pivot point in looking at recessions. And sort of the pre-1990 recessions, they were business cycle recessions, the sort of typical historical recessions that you would read about in the economic history textbooks that we all looked at when we were in undergrads or in college. And then there's the post-1990 recessions, which were really born of crises. And John looked at the 2001 recession in the US, which was essentially a culmination of the end of the dot-com boom and then 9/11, and then the financial crisis triggering the 2008-2009 recession, and of course the 2020 recession being triggered by the COVID shock. And so looking ahead to the next recession, John says, what we could see is the economy continuing to sort of hum along nicely, strong labor markets without seeing a wage price spiral. But then suddenly the economy hits a wall and we see a sudden stop. And he says there's a couple things that he could see triggering this. One would be an external shock, maybe a geopolitical event, some sort of financial event, and that would just halt the economy in its tracks. And I think intuitively, we can probably come to the conclusion that we kind of know how the Fed would deal with that sort of sudden stop from an external shock. We know what the playbook is. We've seen it in the most recent recessions. And so therefore, it's probably reasonable to expect that's the way they would react to an external shock, sudden stop recession. But then John says it might not be something like an external shock. It might be something kind of unidentifiable where we have a sudden stop based on the accumulation, on the weight of small imbalances that have been collecting momentum over the years, and that finally the economy just stops because of that sort of weight that has picked up over those years. So I think it's interesting because this next recession, John posits, may not be like recessions that we've already seen. And so from that standpoint, I think it's a really interesting and thought-provoking read, because it sort of forces us to conceptualize something that we're not necessarily already familiar with.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in that respect, because the way markets at least are pricing a recession is like a gradual slow recession or a hard landing, which again would be of the model that we've seen in kind of the historical past, where you see multiple quarters, it sort of suddenly, it kind of gradually slows down, and so you can wait for the turn and then join the momentum of the turn. But something we learned from COVID was, although that was government instituted, there was a sudden shock, a sudden stop. And so to think about how that could occur today, I think is an interesting one, where everything goes smoothly, then suddenly you have this air pocket where the economy just like slows down sharply. I think that's quite an interesting way of looking at the dynamics that we have.
To use a trading analogy, which might not be perfect, but I'll use it anyhow. I remember sort of in the carry days in the early noughties leading up to the financial crisis, Aussie yen and Aussie Swiss as examples performed incredibly well, and they sort of climbed the stairway and you earned your carry, and that was performing the way it was supposed to until it didn't. And then we had Lehman, we had all these different shocks to the system. And all of that sort of gradual build up just suddenly stopped. And that points maybe to the scenario that John's talking about, where we might have some sort of geopolitical or financial event occur that engenders that. But the concept of things sort of ticking along nicely until they don't is not it's not unprecedented in financial markets.
Yeah. Good. Now, I did want to talk about kind of along similar lines, Grey Swan number 3, which is private markets finally fall over. And this is written by Carl Massey. And Carl Massey's a longtime friend and collaborator with Macro Hive. And he's a bit of an iconoclast, I have to say. While everybody else has a certain way of looking at things, he definitely looks at things very, very differently. And he's got the credentials to prove it. He's worked at hedge funds, prop shops, pension funds, and so on. And in this article, he kind of approaches this question of private markets very kind of elliptically. So he talks about earthquakes in Turkey, about how geologists there talk about the Anatolian fault zone, where everybody knows an earthquake is going to happen, but they don't quite know the exact timing. And he gives a quote from this geologist who talks about houses being rubble in waiting, which I think was a kind of a cute quote. And his point is that, because public markets have been so heavily regulated over the last 10, 15 years, a lot of leverage has basically gone into private markets. And all of this private markets is really built on weak foundations, and they could be particularly challenged by either recessions or high interest rates. So we all know there's a problem here, but we can't quite predict the timing. And he thinks that if there is fragility in the system, it's going to be private markets specifically. And I've looked into this myself, and what's interesting about private markets is that they've grown significantly over the last 10, 15 years, at a time when actually their returns have actually declined. So I was looking at returns of private equity markets compared to public equities. Before 2008, they outperformed public equities by 10%, so massive outperformance. But then after the global financial crisis, up until COVID, their performance was pretty much the same as public equity. So the performance disappeared. And that was a time when public pension funds, for example, and insurance companies allocated massively towards private equity and private markets. Now, since COVID, their returns have improved again. But interestingly, if you look at this year, when every risk market in the world has blown up, private equity returns, at least for the data we have up to the end of June, are actually up 10%. At least their publicly stated returns are up 10%, when public markets are obviously down 10, 15%. So the gap between the two is really, really quite large. And so that's another angle through which private markets could unravel, where the mark-to-markets, when they do get mark-to-market, suddenly people will do withdrawals. And already in the last few days, actually, after we published this note, there's been stories about some private equity firms with the prefix of black something, announcing limitations on how people can liquidate their withdrawals, liquidate their investments in private equity funds, real estate, and private credit. So already we're starting to see some of those tremors occurring already. And then Carl ends with a poem from St. Vincent Millet's Second Fig, where he says, "Safe upon the solid rock the ugly houses stand. Come and see my shining palace built upon the sand." So all the shiny stuff, the glamorous shiny stuff, sort of built on the foundations of sand, whereas the ugly stuff is built on solid ground. And so private markets are certainly the glamorous shiny end.
I think what I loved about this piece, Bilal, were the turns of phrase that Carl employed throughout. I mean, anyone who can equate earthquake engineering with private equity and private credit, I think is doing something right. And the rubble in waiting really sort of struck me as well. I also found his description of crypto very evocative. That rotting shack made of straw, which I think is quite a strong statement when it comes to crypto. But a very, very interesting piece with great language in it.
So we've done about 4 Great Swans. So we've done about half of them. Let's. What's the next one that you want to tackle?
So I'm going to look at one written by a chap named Bilal Hafeez. I don't know if you know his work. He's somebody that I follow quite closely. And this one is Disney buys TikTok. And so I'll lay it out, Bilal. And at the end, when I'm done, if there's anything I've missed, you can certainly pipe up and correct me. But the general premise on this is, I mean, Disney has been hemorrhaging as a business. Its market cap has roughly halved in less than 2 years, from $350 billion to $180 billion. And one of the things I really, I think that illustrated this quite nicely, and the way you wrote it was quite effective, was that streaming has been a disaster, and you actually looked at the economics of streaming within a Disney context. And those economics are just incredibly grim. And so Bob Iger's returning as CEO, and he's tasked to turn Disney around. And your view in the Gray Swan piece is that rather than attack the cost base, Iger, who has a taste for acquisitions, will look to actually make a sizable acquisition to try and add to Disney's portfolio of businesses and turn the company around. And then you highlighted a handful of targets. So there was Nintendo, EA, Spotify, and Snap, but then you settled on TikTok as the biggest move for Disney and the Gray Swan that you think that they will pursue. And then you point out, TikTok has very loyal user base. They spend hours on the app. and that regulators in the US would probably view the deal kindly. You did say that you're unsure how Disney would finance the deal and how good TikTok would be for Disney, but that acquiring something as big and notorious as TikTok would provide a distraction for investors from the sort of doom and gloom that they've been dealing with over the past couple of years. I think what I really liked about this piece is that it takes quite a few disparate pieces. It takes Disney, which is a behemoth company, the return of a CEO who's very acquisitive in nature, a massive acquisition target, potentially favorable regulatory regime, and then ask why not. So yeah, I think an interesting piece. That would be quite mind-blowing if Disney decided to buy TikTok. But yeah, a really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that motivated me with this is that, you know, having observed Bob Iger, who's returning as CEO, he was lauded for all the acquisitions that Disney made historically. He bought Marvel and then Fox, and so that's in his DNA. He's like a growth CEO, and I've worked at lots of big companies, and it's very hard for a growth CEO to become a cost CEO. And I think that he's, you know, he'll initially try to manage the costs, but I think in the end, he'll go back to his default, which is acquisitions. And TikTok's everywhere. I mean, TikTok is, you know, everybody uses it. And there's synergies, you know, like Disney has so much content, it can be repackaged into sort of TikTok, they can be upsell to merchandise and so on. So there's lots of interesting synergies that could happen there. So anyway, you heard it here first.
Nice one. So which one do you want to look at next?
So what I'll do next is Australia. This is Grey Swan number 9. This was written by Ben Ford in our team. So he's one of the up-and-coming stars in our team, and he looks at Australia amongst the other economies. And his Grey Swan event is that Australia booms next year. So, you know, Australia's been battered over the course of this year. You've had central banks hiking, you've had the China lockdown, you know, people are worried about the housing market and so on. So, but he argues that there's 2 or 3 things that could change. One is that the Fed may not hike as much as everyone thinks. And, you know, perhaps the world can live with interest rates at 4.5%, 5%. And so that's fine for Australia. Meanwhile, the RBA is coming almost to the end of its hiking cycle, and perhaps it doesn't raise rates further. And perhaps most importantly, China leaves its zero COVID strategy. And this was actually written before all the recent speculation about China's lifting its own lockdown. So if we do see this reopening of China, this will be a huge boom China will have. And Australia is in some way a high beta play on China. Now, of course, there's some geopolitics there that they need to manage their relationship with China and so on. But you could have an environment where suddenly the backdrop for Australia switches, where the RBA is not hiking as much, China's booming, and suddenly Australia looks great. And at the moment, consensus is looking for quite a sharp drop in growth in Australia from around 4% this year down to under 2%, which is a larger slowdown than, say, New Zealand. And so he argues that as a risk, as a Grey Swan, this could be one of the big ones for 2023.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, look, what's going to happen in China in 2023 is anybody's guess. And of course, the sort of recent social unrest we've seen there and the impact on policy is going to play out in a very interesting way. But I think like Australia's economy really is a decent proxy on what's going to be going on in China, I think, in many ways. And so let's see how that plays out. But as a Grey Swan, I think it's a very interesting piece to have written and definitely an interesting read.
Yeah. Now we have a couple more Grey Swans left. What's the next one you want to focus on, Richard?
So this is a great one from Dominique Dorfraco, who's obviously part of our Macro Hive team. And this one is Elon Musk avatars take Twitter offline. So I kind of there's a hint of allegory in this piece, and maybe even a slight nod to Greek mythology. Icarus flying too close to the sun, maybe, I'm not sure. But the idea is Dominique it's a story. It's written in story form, the way the earlier piece on the German coup was written. And it's Dominique up very early in the morning in LA, going through news and looking through Twitter. And she's taken aback by a tweet from Elon Musk where he says, "I made an offer." and he asks readers what he should buy next via a Twitter poll. And there was 4 big names listed, and loads of people were voting. And Dominique was looking at the poll as it unwound and seeing which one was in the lead. And before she could actually cast her vote, a more powerful Elon Musk pops up on her screen, admonishing the previous Elon Musk. And then what this does is it triggers a series of even more powerful Musks tweeting and admonishing the previous ones. Each of these Elon Musks has more blue ticks than the previous ones do. And so this goes on for a while, and then it all ends when there's a gigantic blue check mark appearing, and then everything went dark. So this presumably was the end of Twitter, and Musk went completely off the grid. And I found this, like I said, very allegorical. And what's clear right now is that Twitter seems to be in the process of becoming a very different place to what it has been. And the sort of the noises that we're hearing from Musk is that a lot of changes are coming, and that this is going to be a different sort of thing.
Yeah. And I do think it would be quite ironic, if he's allowing so many old accounts come back online, and so perhaps it's easier for bots to be built. And if you recall, when he first announced the new checkmark thing, immediately people bought checkmarks impersonating other people, and they had to shut that down. So they're going to have missteps. And so I could easily see a scenario where fake Elon Musk accounts start to pop up, and nobody knows quite who to believe.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, like, I don't know, it was 40+ billion that he paid for it, and the idea here is that if Twitter, in Dominique's piece, is that if Twitter suddenly goes dark and disappears, does that take Elon Musk with it? And Dominique's allegorical piece, it does. But let's see how this unwinds in real life. But anyhow, a very interesting piece. Very well written, and certainly gives us some food for thought. Which one do you want to focus on next?
Yeah, so I'm going to focus on Grey Swan number 2, which was written by our very own Richard Jones, yourself, which is that Newcastle United will win the Premier League. Now, this would be a Grey Swan, maybe even a Black Swan event for next year. And it does remind me somewhat of the time when Leicester City won the Premier League, which was back in the 2015-16 season. And the way you write this is interesting. So essentially, your argument is that, well, actually, number one, Newcastle are already in the top 4. They're third or so in the league. So they're already doing very, very well. In some ways, they're already surprising everybody with how well they're doing. Now, Manchester City, though, are the top dog. Everybody expects them to win. All the odds are, they've won all the Premier Leagues in recent years, bar one. And one of your points there is that they've actually gone through a lot of transition in their team. They've lost a lot of good players like Sterling and Jesus. They've got Haaland, who's come in now, who's done really, really well, but he's actually scoring less in recent matches than earlier matches. So it seems like other teams are adapting to the Haaland phenomena. So perhaps Manchester City is in a transition year. Then you have Arsenal, which you actually support yourself. And they're top of the league. But your argument there is they don't have a big sort of depth in their squad. So if they do suddenly get a few injuries, the whole thing could fall apart. So then that leaves Newcastle. And your argument there is they've got a great manager, Eddie Howe, who's somehow kind of done his magic and sort of allowed them to pull up. They've had some good strategic buys in terms of players. Trippier is one. He's a great defender, plays for England right now. And then Isaac and a few other players. Callum Wilson's been doing very well. And then before you know it, you could end up seeing Newcastle on top if Arsenal and Manchester City do stumble. The one complaint I do have about your piece is that I'm a Liverpool fan, and I don't think you mentioned Liverpool in there as a potential dark horse. I know Liverpool have struggled a bit, but but you never know. They could come back up or so.
Well, so I think the key point to make is that this really still is City's title to lose. I mean, it's not in error that the bookies have them and the betting markets have them as the overwhelming favorites. And I think Arsenal, they've just got some very bad news on the injury front, where Gabriel Jesus is going to be out for as much as 3 months after injuring himself in the World Cup. And, I think the key thing for Newcastle might be this January transfer window, because the last two windows, they've shown that they can make transformative signings. And this time last year, they were in the relegation zone. Like, everybody was worried about them going down. And Howe guided them to a sort of a mid-table finish. Started this season, as you say, overachieving. I think nobody had them third place going into the World Cup in the preseason. So, and if they have very deep pockets, they have a management team that's able to make transformative signings. So, I think even if it's cities to lose, I think that Newcastle, you really do have to keep an eye on them. And if they did win, I think it would be Grey Swan verging on Black Swan, but I still think it wouldn't be a complete and utter surprise given the fact how methodical they've been and how they've risen up the table over the past year. And as far as Liverpool goes, Bilal, I think that, maybe next year, I think maybe you need to get this ownership thing perhaps sorted, because that's added a ripple. And the new signing, Nunez, I think will probably come very, very good next year, but I think he's had a kind of an uneven start to the season. As an Arsenal fan, I'm always fearful of Liverpool, but very much so next year when the new season starts.
That's great. I mean, we have one more Grey Swan left. Richard, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, this is another one from Dominique, and this is U.S. banks will be forced to raise capital. And so Dominique opens the piece by talking about how we all dodged a bullet with the collapse of FTX before it could become really connected with banks and markets, that it would become systemic. So that was a bullet dodge, but nonetheless, with the end of the zero interest rate policy in the US, it does represent a big paradigm shift for the financial system in the US, and that the era of loose financial conditions has bred financial excesses. And Dominique highlights four different sources of systemic problems, potential systemic problems in the US. She talks about shadow banking, and that could be a source of problems, and that regulators are already demonstrating that they are a little bit concerned about shadow banking. So that's one definitely to keep an eye on. And the second was that banks might be involved in any shadow banking crisis, either through direct funding or by lending to firms propped up by shadow banks. The banks are also potentially have a lot of zombie borrowers in their books who can't afford the high interest costs that we've seen with this new high interest rate regime. And then the fourth thing that Dominique highlights is that banks might also suffer through very large mandated holdings of government paper, which have fallen in value as rates have risen. So with all of these sort of different threads, Dominique sort of concludes her piece by saying that she would be very surprised if you didn't see US banks forced to raise equity capital in the next year or so.
Yeah, I think that really is a Grey Swan, because, even within our Grey Swans, we talked about how private markets are most vulnerable, but Dominic goes a step further to say actually the regulated bank that's supposed to be safe, they could actually come under fire. And as you rightly points out, I mean, they surely are exposed to the shadow system as much as anyone else. So it's a great and compelling case there. So I do want to just sort of summarize all the Grey Swans, because we've gone through a whole bunch. So Grey Swan number one is Disney buys TikTok. Grey Swan number two, Newcastle to win the Premier League. I was about to say Liverpool, but it's a Freudian slip there. Grey Swan three, private markets finally fall over. Number four, peculiar German coup. 5, Japan hikes rates. 6, US banks forced to raise capital. 7, a recession like no other. This is the slowly and suddenly. Number 8, Elon Musk avatars take Twitter offline. And finally, Australia's economy booms. Now, if people have any questions, this is your chance to ask some questions. And already somebody has sent me a link to a news story from today, which is just broken a few hours ago, which is that Germany arrests 25 accused of plotting a coup. And so we published our Germany coup thing a week ago, and already looks like somebody's trying to instigate a coup in Germany. And actually, he doesn't look like the type of person. He looks quite respectable. So that's an interesting. It's a minor aristocrat called Heinrich the 13th. So it looks like it's not quite the type of people you'd expect. So there's a few questions coming through. One is, can we speak a bit more about the recession like no other, and what brings it on? So I think what John talked about, Richard, if you just remind me, John's trigger points for what could bring this sudden drop in a recession.
So the one thing that John highlighted that I think is if this is going to happen, it'll be this is a relatively high delta reason, is that we get some sort of geopolitical or financial shock that comes out of the blue and nobody's expecting it. And so therefore we get this sudden stop.
Yeah, and I think aside from that, I think the other ones, I think there could be something to with housing, I think, because already, housing numbers have been weakening within the US. Now, there isn't as much leverage in the housing system as there was in the 2000s. But if you see quite a dramatic decline in prices, so the price move is so large, that could instigate some kind of wealth shock across the US. And already people's saving rates have been falling. And so people may not feel comfortable to reduce their savings rate further. They may go into risk aversion mode. So perhaps there could be a channel through housing, which is not our base case, but if there was a more dramatic sort of drop on that side. Another thing also is that the US has had quite good CapEx numbers over the last year. Companies have been spending on upgrading their tech, and we're already seeing tech companies have started to roll over, and so maybe there could be a big pullback in terms of corporate spending, quite a sudden one, even just like we've had all these announcements in the last month or two of job cuts in the tech sector. So that could be another one as well that you could see a big drop.
Yeah, and we do know that corporate and household balance sheets are in a fairly strong position in the US, historically speaking. Having said that, though, like you say, if we do get a sort of a retrenchment based perhaps on housing, then that could be the trigger, and you get a very defensive posture from the household sector. And I could see that sort of spilling into the corporate sector as well. It could very easily happen.
Yeah. Then there's another question. Do you think high money supply can contribute to a less severe recession? So what's the relationship between money supply in 2023, and then your view on gold? I mean, what I would say about money supply is I think it's a really tricky one. The relationship between money supply and growth is really unstable, and I don't find it to be a very good predictor. What is better is credit growth, or the credit impulse and growth. So you're looking at not necessarily deposits held at banks, but you look at bank lending to the private sector and how that's changing. Now, at the moment, the numbers are quite good there. The credit impulse has been quite positive. So interestingly, banks have been lending to the private sector in the US, which suggests, at least for now, the US economy is supported. And you see that with nowcasting GDP numbers in the US, that outside of manufacturing, the economy is actually humming along okay. So for now, the credit numbers are telling you that the US is in relatively okay growth sort of shape. So for me, the thing to monitor is if this credit impulse starts to go down and starts to go negative, then that would be a good signal that you could be about to enter a recession. So the signals like yield curve inversion, which is already telling you there's a high chance of recession, you could get a confirmation signal if the credit numbers roll over. Then on gold, I mean, I don't really have a strong view on gold. I think that in general, to some extent, it depends on what the Fed does. I mean, if the Fed is really aggressive in hiking, then I think gold will struggle. I do think in the near term, at least, gold is supported, because I think real yields are stable down and are falling as we go into next year. The dollar's weaker as well. So I think we're in a sort of generally positive environment for gold right now. But I think for the year as a whole, it's less clear where that will go. Now, I'll just take one or two more questions before we round off. Actually, we'll just take this as the final set of questions. And that is, were there some gray swans that we didn't include, but we were considering to include? Richard, did you have any other ideas apart from the ones that you contributed?
Yeah, I was going to write one on Arsenal winning the Premier League, but you quite, I think, judiciously ruled that out.
Yeah.
And
I think the other grey swans that we were thinking about were some of the invasion ones, like China invades Taiwan, or there's an Iran war, or those sorts of things. But I find with those ones, they're so well known, everybody has them as risks, that I don't feel like they warranted any sort of special attention, because everybody has them as risk scenarios, like conflict in Middle East, Taiwan. I mean, these are like so well known that I don't think they could come on the list. What one I did think about, but I wasn't quite sure how to frame it, was around AI. So over the past week, this Chat GPT has been released, which shows you how clever AI can be, where you can sort of type in something like, write me an essay on this subject, and it will write you an essay, or write me a legal contract, and it will write you a contract. And I think this whole AI thing, I think we're at the cusp of a major development breakthroughs that are going to permeate the world next year. So I think something in the AI space, which is, it's going to feel like magic, the technology, a bit like the internet. And I think we got so obsessed with crypto as a revolution. I think AI is a revolution, not crypto. And I think in the next 12 months, we're going to see something massive. So I think that's some kind of grey swan, but I wasn't sure how to frame it. But that was something I was thinking about.
well, the thing about AI too is that in Dominique's Twitter Grey Hive, there was certain Grey Hive, Grey Swan. There was certainly elements of AI playing out in that, with all these sort of Elon Musks with more blue ticks regenerating themselves again and again. Yeah, but I agree. Like that's going to be a very, very interesting theme going into 23. And even if it is difficult to frame it, I think Dominique did capture it a little bit in her Grey Swan piece.
That's good. Okay, well, great. We can wrap it up there then. Thanks a lot, everybody, for attending this webinar. Hopefully you enjoyed it. You can read about all the grey swans if you go to the macrohive.com website. It's all free in front of the paywall. And make sure to sign up for the free newsletter. And if you have any grey swan ideas of your own, just email me, and we'll share it with the broader community. And aside from that, if we don't see you, or you don't hear us from us again, have a good holiday period, and have a great start to 2023. And once again, thank you, Richard, for co-hosting this with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And
thanks, everyone.
Good rest of the year.
Cheers.